At 6:45 p.m., my nephew collapsed on the kitchen floor and was rushed to the hospital. At 2:47 a.m., I was lying in bed, still in my boots, when the phone rang. A close friend I'd known for 30 years whispered, "Go to the hospital immediately. Alone. Don't call your son. Don't text your daughter-in-law." I was already in the van before she finished. When I arrived, a nurse I'd trusted for 30 years closed the door, looked me straight in the eye, and said something that sent chills down my spine. "Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment telling me what you're doing. While you listen driving, cooking, or winding down, I genuinely read every one. Quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection, but the heart of the story, the lesson, is what I hope stays with you." The text arrived at 5:32 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I knew before I even opened it that the pattern had completed itself. My name is Eugene Hartley. I'm 60 years old, 2 years retired from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and I've spent the last 8 years watching my son Wade with the careful eye of a man who built his career, reading lies in ledger lines. The phone screen glowed in the gathering December dusk of my Northwest Portland Craftsman home, and the message was from Brennan, my 17-year-old grandson. "Grandpa, I don't feel well today. Mom made me stay home from school." Simple words, the kind a kid sends without thinking twice. But I'd been thinking about them for 6 weeks straight. I set the phone down on my desk and opened the bottom drawer. The small blue leather notebook sat exactly where I'd left it that morning. Same style I'd carried for 30 years, tracking mortgage fraud, corporate embezzlement, offshore account schemes across 3 federal districts. My hand knew the weight of it before my fingers closed around the spine. I flipped to the latest page and logged the details. In the careful block print I'd used to document, 1,000 felonies, December 6th, 2023, 5:32 p.m. Brennan home, sick, Wednesday. Then I traced backward through the previous entries, my thumb sliding across the ink that had dried weeks ago. November 22nd, Friday. Brennan home, sick. November 8th, Wednesday. Brennan homesick. October 25th, Friday. Brennan homesick. In 30 years with the IRS, I learned one absolute truth. No pattern is ever truly random. Numbers don't lie. Timing doesn't drift. And when you see the same sequence repeat across a controlled interval, someone is forcing the pattern into place. 3 illnesses, 6 weeks. Every single one landing on Wednesday or Friday, the exact days Colleen cooked at home and packed Brennan's water flask for school. Colleen Hartley, 35 years old, civil litigation attorney, my daughter-in-law, for the past 9 years. Sharp mind, sharper ambition, and the kind of methodical precision that made her dangerous in a courtroom. The kind of precision that could plan something terrible and never leave a fingerprint on the surface. I didn't know anything yet, not really. But I suspected, and 30 years in a federal service taught me those are 2 very different things. The house smelled like old wood, and the faint metallic tang of Portland winter rain coming through the cracked window above the sink. I could hear the neighborhood settling into evening cars pulling into driveways, doors closing, the ordinary sounds of families coming home to dinner. My coffee had gone cold in the mug beside the notebook, but I didn't reach for it. I just stared at those 3 dates and felt the old investigative instinct tighten like a fist in my chest. How many fathers spend 3 decades hunting criminals, only to find the coldest fraud living in their own son's house? The call came at 6:45 p.m. Wade Hartley, 38. My son by blood, if not by character anymore, spoke with the kind of manufactured panic that only a man with something to hide can produce. "Dad, it's Brennan. He just collapsed. We're taking him to OHSU. Meet us there." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. I stood in the quiet living room with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone hum against the side of my head. My operational mind immediately shifted into the cold mechanical process I'd used 1,000 times before. Intake the information, reconstruct the timeline, identify the gaps. Later, much later, after Ivy finally found the courage to speak, I pieced together what happened at 6:15 p.m. From her words, her voice shaking, but her memory precise, the way traumatized children's memories sometimes are. Brennan's knees buckled without warning, she told me. Not dramatic, just gone. He hit the granite tile hard, and she dialed 911 with shaking hands, while Colleen emerged from her home office. No panic, no tears, just efficient, quiet movement. Ivy watched her slide Brennan's water flask into her designer bag, while the 911 dispatcher was still asking questions. She was 12 years old. She remembered every detail. She just hadn't known yet that what she saw would matter. Wade arrived 10 minutes after the paramedics left. Hair damp from a shower, collar still wet. He claimed he'd rushed from a meeting downtown, but his timeline didn't survive even casual scrutiny. The blue notebook had documented mortgage fraud, embezzlement, corporate theft spanning 18 states. Never once had it tracked the murder of my own grandson. I stood in the dark living room now, truck keys heavy in my right hand, staring down at the open notebook on my desk. The pattern stared back at me with mathematical certainty. 3 illnesses, 6 weeks, everyone landing on the days she controlled his food. No variance, no drift, just cold calculated repetition. For 30 years I'd tracked financial criminals, who traded human lives for percentages on spreadsheets, who destroyed families over decimal points, who measured worth in offshore account balances. But I never imagined the name on the ledger would belong to my own blood. I grabbed my coat from the hall closet, the heavy wool one Margaret bought me 20 years ago, back when she was still alive and Wade was still the kind of son who called on Sundays. The notebook went into my inside pocket, the weight of it pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. I pulled my old F-150 out of the driveway into the freezing December rain, the notebook resting on the passenger seat beside me. The 4-mile drive to OHSU had never felt longer. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, and the city lights blurred into long streaks of yellow and red through the water. I didn't know yet about the thallium, the insurance policies, or the 14-day countdown, but I knew the pattern in that blue notebook wasn't tracking an illness. It was tracking an execution, and somewhere in that hospital my grandson was fighting for his life, while the people who put him there stood at his bedside, wearing masks of concern. 8 hours later, at 2:47 in the morning, my phone would ring with the call that confirmed every terrible suspicion. I spent 8 hours in that hospital waiting room before they sent me home. By midnight, I couldn't stand to watch Wade's polished performance of concern anymore, so I drove back and lay on top of the covers, with my boots still on waiting. The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, and in 30 years of tracking financial criminals, I had learned that only 2 types of calls cross a landline at that hour. The kind that tells you someone is dead, and the kind that tells you something far worse has just begun. Ruth Sinclair, 63 head nurse at OHSU, and a friend I'd trusted for 3 decades, spoke in a ragged whisper I'd never heard from her before. Pure, unfiltered fear, wrapped in clinical precision. Eugene, get down to OHSU right now. Alone. Do not call Wade. Do not text Colleen. Just get in your truck and get here. The line went dead. I swung my legs out of bed without asking a single question. Keys from the nightstand, the blue notebook, coat from the hook. The rain hammered the windshield as I drove through Portland's empty 3 a.m. streets, Ruth's tone playing on repeat in my head. Do not call Wade. When a trusted friend tells you to come alone without alerting your own family, there's only one reason your family is the threat. OHSU's 4th-floor consultation room was windowless gray walls and sharp antiseptic smell. Ruth waited by the door, looking older than I'd ever seen her. Lines etched, deep eyes red-rimmed. Standing beside her was a woman in a navy trench coat with a small gold investigator badge. Detective Lorraine Foster, the woman said. Multnomah County Financial Crimes. Working joint jurisdiction with Clackamas County on the Lake Oswego property. I need you to see these documents before we proceed. 45 sharp eyes, professional calm. I shook her hand and Ruth gestured me to sit. This isn't severe flu or allergic reaction, Ruth said, hands trembling on the laminate table. OHSU's toxicology lab ran an expedited 9-hour panel. The results came back an hour ago. Brennan has thallium in his system. Cumulative systematic exposure over several weeks. Someone has been poisoning your grandson. The words landed like stones in water. Ivy mentioned a missing water flask when paramedics arrived, Ruth continued. A 12-year-old watching her mother slip something into a designer bag while her brother was dying on the kitchen floor. That's when I called Detective Foster. What does it mean when the person who teaches you to read balance sheets grows up to forge one with your grandson's life as the closing debit? Detective Foster placed two documents flat on the table. Official seals, the kind of evidence that speaks for itself. Document 1, she said. Private life insurance policy taken out 6 weeks ago. $5 million on the life of Brennan Hartley, minor child. Policyholder and sole primary beneficiary, Wade Eugene Hartley. 6 weeks, the exact timeline my notebook had been tracking. Document 2, Foster continued. The trust fund structure established by your late wife, Margaret, for Brennan's benefit. $8 million in principal. Legal control transfers to Brennan the day he turns 18, which is 14 days from now. But there's a contingency clause. She circled 3 lines with her pen. If the primary beneficiary dies before reaching majority age, the entire sum reverts to the legal parents of record, Wade and Colleen Hartley. I looked down at the math. $5 million in insurance, $8 million in trust principal, $13 million total, and a 14-day fuse burning down to nothing. Margaret built that trust when Brennan was 8, I said. She died 4 years ago. Wade has known about that contingency clause since the day she drafted it, and 6 weeks ago, Foster said, he added the insurance policy. Then the illnesses started. I had seen every variation of human greed distilled into financial ledgers. But the moment Wade's name appeared on that beneficiary line, something inside my chest folded in on itself like paper catching fire. Wade and Colleen are currently in Portland. Foster continued, not at a San Francisco conference like they reported to the ICU nurse station. We have credit card receipts, security footage, cell tower pings. They never left the city. The alibi is manufactured. Ruth's hand settled on my shoulder. There's one more thing you need to see, Eugene. It's waiting on the security terminal. She moved to a compact desktop monitor hooked into the hospital's internal security network. The screen glowed blue in the dim room, casting shadows across her face. The next part includes footage pulled under Detective Foster's emergency authorization, Ruth said quietly. And once you see it, Eugene, there's no walking this back. Her finger hovered over the play button. 30 years hunting financial criminals had taught me how to read evidence bank statements, wire transfers, offshore accounts criminals thought were invisible. But I'd never had to watch footage of my own son executing a murder plan with the methodical precision I'd taught him to use on spreadsheets. Ruth's hand trembled above the keyboard. When you're ready, she whispered. I looked at the blank monitor and understood that whatever appeared on that screen would be the moment I lost my son forever, not to death, but to something worse. The knowledge that the boy I'd raised, the man whose name I shared, had calculated the exact dollar value of his own child's life, and decided the number was acceptable. Play it, I said. Ruth pressed the button. The monitor flickered to life. The timestamp on the hospital security feed read 7:23 p.m. 1 hour and 8 minutes after Brennan had been admitted to the ICU. While her son was being stabilized on the 4th floor, Colleen walked the pharmacy corridor 1 floor below and disposed of the evidence. She didn't go to his room first. The footage was clinical, high-angle overhead view from OHSU's pharmacy corridor. Colleen walked through the frame with the brisk, efficient stride of someone who belonged there, face angled down from the camera lens, designer bag on her left shoulder. She paused at the biohazard disposal bin, mounted to the wall, pulled something from her coat pocket, a small clear glass vial, maybe 2 inches long, and dropped it through the slot, with the casual precision of someone checking off an item on a to-do list. Then she turned the corner and disappeared. She walked the pharmacy corridor 1 floor below while her son was being stabilized. Above her, Detective Foster said quietly. She didn't go to his room first. This wasn't panic. This was procedure. Ruth leaned forward and tapped the monitor. I flagged this during my shift review. Recognized her from the ICU waiting room. Retrieved the vial under strict clinical protocol and sent it directly to the lab. It's thallium residue, Foster said. Concentrated, the kind you don't accidentally carry in your coat pocket. I stared at the frozen image of Colleen's silhouette on the screen. The woman who brought homemade lasagna to Sunday dinners. The woman who'd sat across from me at Thanksgiving 3 weeks ago and asked about my retirement plans with perfect conversational warmth. There's more. Foster continued, sliding a printed receipt across the table. When the hospital called Wade and Colleen at 7:30 p.m. to report Brennan's critical condition, They answered on a joint line, claimed they were stuck at a San Francisco financial summit and couldn't clear a flight until morning due to weather. She tapped the receipt. Credit card time-stamped 8:15 p.m. Lake Oswego Bistro, 3 miles from their house. They never left Portland. The San Francisco call was a calculated performance. While they waited for the hospital to call them with news of Brennan's death, Ruth said, her voice flat and cold, in a way I'd never heard from her before. I had spent 3 decades watching financial criminals through the cold lens of evidence preservation transaction logs, bank statements, audit trails that never lied. But watching my daughter-in-law dispose of the exact poison she'd been feeding my grandson was the first time I understood that some ledgers close in ways that can never be balanced. I stood, the chair scraped against linoleum. "We need about 6 hours to get search and arrest warrants finalized," Detective Foster said behind me as I moved toward the exit. "The judge will sign them first thing in the morning." 6 hours, I repeated without turning around. "But that house is occupied right now," she said quietly, "and one of the children inside is only 12. I didn't answer. I was already through the door. The OHSU parking structure at 3:50 a.m. was concrete and echoes, and the rain hammering the metal roof of my F-150 like artillery fire. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and dialed my brother's number. Howard Hartley, 62, younger than me by 3 years, former Marine, who understood that when I called at 4 in the morning without saying, "Sorry, it wasn't a conversation, it was a deployment order." He answered on the second ring, no greeting, just silence, waiting for coordinates. "Get to Wade's place in Lake Oswego," I said, "right now. Ivy is in that house." 4 seconds of dead air, then the sound of heavy boots hitting a workshop floor. 15 minutes, Howard said, and the line went dead. No questions asked. No explanations required. Just the immediate tactical response of a man who'd spent 20 years following orders that meant life or death. I dropped the truck into gear and swung onto I-5 South, pushing the old engine hard through standing water. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the December deluge, and the city blurred into streaks of sodium light and rain. My mind filtered the situation into 3 distinct tactical tracks. Track 1, Wade and Colleen were loading vehicles right now, preparing to flee the state before morning warrants dropped. Everything they couldn't afford to leave behind: cash, offshore account documentation, fake IDs. They'd been smart enough to prepare in advance. Track 2, they were sanitizing the house of remaining chemical evidence, burning ledgers, wiping hard drives, flushing bottles down drains, and scrubbing counters with industrial bleach. Track 3, the one making me press the accelerator to the floorboards. They were waiting to see if the hospital confirmed Brennan's death before making their final move on Ivy, a 12-year-old witness who'd watched her mother hide evidence, a 12-year-old problem that needed to be solved before sunrise. 3 distinct tracks, one common denominator: Ivy could not be left unprotected with either of them for 1 more hour. How many fathers race through a December rainstorm at 4 in the morning, knowing they're driving toward the exact moment they'll have to choose between their son's life and their grandchildren's survival? I passed the lower exit ramp doing 70 in a 55 zone and caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a dark sedan idling without lights near the access road corner. No movement, no indicators, just sitting there in the rain like a shadow waiting for permission to move. I memorized the plate digits automatically. Old investigative habit. The Lake Oswego exit appeared through the sheets of rain at 4:08 a.m., the sodium lights painting the wet asphalt in dark amber. My phone vibrated once, a text from Howard. "In position. Side garage. Lights on inside. Movement 2nd floor." I killed my headlights and rolled into the Westlake neighborhood, with only the faint glow of distant porch lights to guide me. The streets were empty, every house dark except one. The house I'd purchased 12 years ago as a wedding gift for Wade and his new wife. The house I'd kept in my name because I'd learned by then that my son didn't understand the difference between investment and inheritance. The house where my 12-year-old granddaughter was sleeping or trying to sleep under the same roof as 2 people who had already proven they would kill a child for money. Every window blazed with light, interior movement visible through the sheer curtains, shadows crossing back and forth with the frantic energy of people trying to finish something before dawn. I pulled the truck to a stop 3 houses down, engine ticking in the rain, and reached into my glove box for the single key I'd never given Wade, the original landlord copy that opened the side utility door. Inside that house, they were destroying evidence, packing suitcases, making final calculations about what to do with the last witness. And they had no idea I was about to walk through a door they didn't even know I could open. The spare key was still beneath the carnation planter where I'd left it 12 years ago, and when I slid it into the side utility door at 4:10 a.m., the lock turned without a sound. I stepped into the house I'd purchased in 2012, my name still on the primary deed as corporate lessor, because Wade had never completed the title transfer I'd offered him 3 times. The illusion of luxury that had always seemed so carefully maintained was completely unraveled now. Colleen stood over an open suitcase on the kitchen island, methodically shoving clothing and legal folders inside with the efficient movements of someone who'd rehearsed this exact sequence. She wasn't panicking. She was executing a checklist. In the living room nook, Wade knelt before the stone fireplace, frantically feeding loose financial ledgers into the flames page after page, curling into ash sweat, cutting lines through the soot smeared across his face. His hands were shaking so badly he kept dropping sheets onto the hardwood before they reached the fire. I didn't call out to them. My eyes went straight up to the second-floor gallery. The scent of burning paper mixed with Colleen's expensive perfume and the lingering rosemary from whatever dinner they'd cooked hours ago. The house smelled like a crime scene dressed up as a home. Wade didn't even notice the door behind him had opened. He just kept feeding papers into the flames like a man trying to erase his entire history, one transaction at a time. Then I saw her. Ivy stood against the second-floor banister, clutching an old stuffed bear to her chest, her cheeks streaked with tears that caught the harsh overhead lights. When her eyes found mine through the shadows, her shoulders shook, and she dropped her voice to a terrified whisper that somehow carried all the way down into the entryway. "Grandpa, Dad said we had to pack because of an emergency flight, but I heard Mom talking on her office phone earlier. She said tomorrow morning I had to start taking the same liquid vitamins she's been giving Brennan." My chest tightened, but I didn't lose my footing. 30 years of operational discipline held me perfectly still. Over in the corner of the kitchen, beneath the glare of the counter lights, something caught my eye, a small, dark bottle sitting half-hidden behind the coffee maker, the kind of object that completely broke the careful staging of the room. I locked its location into my head without making a move toward it. I had bought this house in 2012, with Margaret's life insurance money, thinking I was securing my son's future. Standing in that kitchen at 4:15 in the morning, watching Wade burn evidence of his own son's murder, I understood that the only future I'd secured was the one where I'd have to choose between bloodline and conscience, and there was no universe where that choice was difficult. The back door flew open. Howard stormed inside, his massive frame moving with the precision of a man who'd spent 20 years breaching hostile structures. He closed the distance to Wade's shoulder in 3 strides, his hand clamping down on Wade's arm and physically yanking him away from the fireplace. Wade spun around, and for one brief second his face went through every stage of recognition, confusion, shock, then the desperate scramble for a cover story. He tried to force a laugh. It came out brittle and manic, the sound of a corporate officer realizing his ledger has gone completely red. "Dad," he said, voice cracking, "you don't understand. You've been played old man. Brennan bought the thallium himself. It's all on his personal email, his own Visa card. He planned this to force the trust fund payout early and frame us. We were just trying to—" "Stop," I said quietly. Howard's grip on Wade's arm tightened. Colleen spun toward the commotion, and for the first time since I'd known her, the corporate smile vanished completely. Her eyes turned to ice. "You have absolutely no idea what you just started, Eugene," she said, her voice dropping to a cold warning. In the distance, barely audible through the fog and rain, I heard the first wail of sirens. Colleen heard it too. Her jaw tightened. The sirens grew louder, closer, multiple vehicles converging on the Westlake neighborhood from different directions with the coordinated precision of a planned operation. Red and blue lights began to pulse through the window glass. 30 years tracking financial fraud had taught me that a collapsed ledger makes a specific sound. When the numbers finally stop adding up, it's the silence right before the auditor closes the book and calls the federal prosecutor. That silence filled the Lake Oswego estate the moment the red and blue lights hit the windows. Detective Foster and 3 county cruisers pulled into the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. I didn't wait for the uniforms to breach the front door. I was already moving up the stairs, my legs carrying me to the second-floor landing where Ivy stood frozen. The moment the front door rattled open and the uniforms poured into the foyer, voices sharp and commanding footsteps heavy on the hardwood, I reached the landing and pulled Ivy into my arms. For the first time since that 2:47 a.m. phone call, I let myself exhale. "You're safe now, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair, though the words felt inadequate for everything she'd witnessed. "You're safe." Below us, the uniforms were already moving, Colleen's hands behind her back. Wade's face pressed against the kitchen island as they read him his rights, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the open floor plan. Ivy's small fingers locked into the wool of my coat as the uniforms guided Wade and Colleen toward the front door, their faces caught in the strobing police lights, orange and blue and red, washing over them in rapid succession. I carried my granddaughter down the stairs toward the open door in the cold December air, and as I crossed the foyer, I caught Wade's eyes one final time. Not remorse, not fear, just cold empty calculation. The look of a man who still believed he had one card left to play. That look would haunt me through everything that came next, through the 9 days Brennan would refuse to see my face, through the forensic accounting that would unravel every lie Wade had built, through the moment I'd have to stand in a courtroom and watch my own son sentenced for trying to murder his children. But right now, at 4:25 in the morning, with Ivy's arms wrapped around my neck and Howard standing at my shoulder, I let myself believe the worst was over. I was wrong. That final look wasn't remorse. It was calculation. And I'd already seen the lie collapse before the words finished forming in his mouth. I didn't blink. I stepped to the fireplace and reached into the flames, pulling out a thick stack of heavy bond paper that hadn't caught fire yet, internal bank statements Wade had been frantically trying to destroy. The edges were singed, but the transaction codes were still legible. "You opened a ghost account in Brennan's name," I said, my voice clinical and flat. "Used a VPN masked IP routed through 3 separate offshore servers. But your transaction timestamps don't match his high school attendance records. He was sitting in a calculus exam when these orders cleared. You weren't." Wade's face went white. "The IP geolocation traces back to your downtown office," I continued. "Not his school, not his phone. Your office. On days you told Colleen you were working late." Colleen's jaw tightened. For the first time since I'd known her, the corporate mask cracked completely. "You have absolutely no idea what you just started, Eugene," she said, her voice dropping to ice. Detective Foster stepped forward, nodded to the uniforms. "That's enough. Take them." I had spent 30 years reading financial fraud through transaction timestamps and IP routing logs. Every lie left a digital fingerprint if you knew where to look. But standing in that living room, watching my son attempt to frame his own dying child for insurance money, I understood that some forms of corruption can't be quantified on any ledger the IRS ever designed. The formal arrest warrants were executed precisely at 6:30 a.m. as gray December dawn broke over Portland. Wade and Colleen were no longer being held for questioning. They were processed, photographed, and booked on felony charges of attempted aggravated murder and criminal conspiracy. I sat on a hard oak bench in the stark concrete corridor of the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. Ivy, fast asleep against my shoulder, her fingers still locked in the fur of her stuffed bear. Howard sat directly across from me, eyes closed, but posture perfectly alert, the stance of a man who could snap awake at the first wrong sound. The uniforms had guided Wade and Colleen through processing at exactly 6:30. Wade's expensive suit looked cheaper under the fluorescent lights. Colleen's designer heels echoed on concrete like a countdown clock. At 6:40 a.m., Detective Foster stepped out of the processing room and walked toward me with the careful stride of someone delivering news that could break in multiple directions. "Brennan has fully regained consciousness," she said quietly. "Medical team cleared him for immediate family contact." I looked down at Ivy's quiet face against my wool coat and thought at least one child in this family is going to sleep safe tonight. Then I stood, gently transferred Ivy to Howard's shoulder. She barely stirred, and pulled my phone from my pocket. The ICU bedside line rang 4 times before Brennan answered. "Hello." His voice was raspy and broken from the oxygen mask, but it was his voice. Alive, conscious, safe. "Brennan," I said, I know who it is." The hardness in his tone hit me like a fist to the chest. "Brennan, I need you to listen. No, he said, and his voice wasn't the voice of a boy looking for protection. It was the voice of a child systematically conditioned for 17 years to believe his grandfather was an isolated cynic out to destroy his parents' success. Get out. You did this to tear our home apart. You've always hated them. I never want to see your face in this room again. The line went dead. I stood in the gray light of the station corridor for a long second, then gently slid the phone back into my pocket quietly, as if trying to pretend nothing inside me had just shattered. What does victory taste like when you've saved your grandson's life, but lost every fragment of trust he ever had in your name? Howard opened his eyes and looked at me across the narrow hallway. He didn't ask what Brennan said on the line. Sometimes an old soldier knows exactly when to keep his mouth shut, and that silence is worth more than any comfort a man can put into words. I looked down at Ivy's sleeping face against his shoulder, her breath steady and safe for the first time in weeks. 300 feet away, Wade and Colleen were being processed in orange jumpsuits. The forensic evidence was airtight. The arrests were clean. The digital frame had collapsed under basic investigative scrutiny. But none of that mattered, because the boy I'd spent 8 years trying to protect the grandson I'd tracked through blue notebook entries and security footage and hospital corridors in the middle of the night had just told me he never wanted to see my face again. Howard stood and placed one heavy hand on my free shoulder. "Give him time, brother," he said quietly. I nodded, but I knew what 30 years of investigation had taught me: some forms of damage take longer to heal than any warrant can fix. 17 years of conditioning don't break in a single phone call. They don't break when you show a kid the bank statements. They don't break when you explain the transaction logs or the VPN routing or the offshore servers his father used to frame him. They break slowly, painfully, one fractured belief at a time. And sometimes they only break when a man sits on a wooden bench outside a locked ICU door for 9 days straight without knocking, without sending messages, without demanding anything except the right to occupy the same hallway as the child he's trying to save. I looked at Howard. "Take Ivy back to my place. Let her sleep in the guest room. I'll be at OHSU. He didn't argue, just nodded once and adjusted Ivy's weight on his shoulder. I walked out of the sheriff's station into the cold December morning, climbed into my F-150, and drove back to the hospital where my grandson had just told me he never wanted to see me again. Because 30 years in federal service had taught me one absolute truth: when the numbers stop adding up, you don't abandon the audit. You sit down, you open the ledger, and you wait for the truth to finish writing itself. Keith Mercer, the name staring back at me from Ruth's financial ledger, was one I'd walked past 100 times in the OHSU pharmacy corridors without a second glance. Night shift pharmacist, 45 years old, with a transaction history that screamed exactly one thing to a retired IRS agent: desperation converted into cash crimes. Ruth's administrative reviews flagged his irregular ATM withdrawals over the past 8 weeks. Ruth said, sliding another sheet across her desk, $800 to $1,200 pulls with no correlation to standard payroll cycles, hitting commercial cash machines outside the hospital pavilion at bizarre hours. I opened my own laptop and pulled up the public records, access I still maintained through my federal retirement credentials. Colleen's secondary personal checking account appeared in seconds, the one Wade probably didn't even know existed. I cross-referenced Ruth's raw timestamp logs against Colleen's withdrawal history. The alignment was flawless. Every single cash withdrawal Colleen made from her regional branch preceded Keith's midnight ATM deposits by less than 3 hours. 8 weeks of data. Perfect 3-hour windows. No variance. No gaps. Total volume $9,600 in untraceable paper currency. Not a corporate fortune, just enough to buy an unlisted industrial toxin from a man with gambling debts and a pharmacy vault keycard. Keith Mercer, I said quietly, studying his administrative photo on the OHSU staff directory. Minor fraud record, heavy gambling debts. Made the critical mistake of accepting Colleen's cash without realizing a retired IRS agent was tracking every ATM withdrawal timestamp for 8 straight weeks. Ruth nodded. Detective Foster has the arrest warrant ready. She's moving on him tomorrow morning. Tell her to hold it for 48 hours, I said. I need him walking his regular shift until we ensure he thinks the perimeter is completely clear. The moment he senses pressure, he'll lawyer up and we lose interrogation leverage. The federal government spent 30 years teaching me that cash crimes leave the cleanest trail. When criminals think they're being clever, they believe paper money disappears into thin air, but every ATM withdrawal gets logged with a timestamp. Every bank account leaves a digital shadow, and every 3-hour window between transactions becomes a prosecutorial gift when you line them up on a spreadsheet and watch the pattern scream premeditation. Days 3 through 6 passed, with the heavy, unyielding rhythm of an old clock mechanism ticking toward inevitable conclusion. Every morning at 7 a.m., I took my place on the oak bench outside Brennan's ICU door. Each day I left a small artifact from our shared history resting on the empty space beside me. A book he used to read when he was 10. A tin of mints he liked a photograph of him and Margaret from a birthday years ago. I never knocked. Late afternoons, Detective Foster provided arraignment tracking updates in terse phone calls that felt like military briefings. Wade's attorneys are filing mitigation motions, she said on day 4. He's starting to give up smaller details to distance himself from Colleen's operational control, trying to paint himself as the reluctant participant. And Colleen, I asked, hasn't spoken a word outside her legal counsel, not one syllable of remorse or explanation. Day 5, same routine, same bench, same silence from Brennan's locked door. Mercer clocked in at 11 p.m. last night, Foster reported. Accessed the pharmacy vault twice, logged his standard inventory counts. He has absolutely no idea we've been 3 steps ahead of him for 5 days. Watching a suspect who doesn't know he's caught yet is like watching a mouse navigate a maze that was designed 6 weeks ago, specifically for him. Every turn he thinks he's choosing freely was actually mapped the moment Ruth called Howard and authorized that kitchen camera. Late afternoon on day 6, I sat in my Northwest Portland living room, reviewing case files on my laptop. The house was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on Burnside and the occasional creak of old wood settling. My phone vibrated. Unlisted number. Not an Oregon prefix. Not a contact in my system. Not a recognizable exchange. I answered. Silence on the other end. Not dead air, the kind of silence that comes from someone holding a phone without speaking. Listening. Then the line dropped. No voicemail prompt. No callback option, just a deliberate disconnect. I stared at the number on my screen. 10 minutes later, Detective Foster called from her personal cell. Eugene, she said without preamble, did you just receive a call from an unlisted number with a 702 Nevada exchange? How did you know? Because our telecom analyst flagged it the second it hit your line, she said, her voice tight. That exchange traces to a Nevada corporate relay service, the kind people use when they don't want their real number on record. Have you ever seen it in Wade's billing history? I pulled up Wade's archived phone logs on my laptop, scrolled back 6 months. The Nevada number appeared exactly 4 times all calls made in the 3 weeks before Brennan's first illness. 4 times, I said, all in October, all before the poisoning started. Foster was quiet for 3 seconds. Eugene Wade wasn't just drowning in gambling debt. Someone was coordinating this operation from outside the immediate conspiracy. Someone with enough operational sophistication to use anonymized phone systems. I stared at that Nevada number glowing on my phone screen long after Foster hung up. 4 calls in 3 weeks, all made before the poisoning began, all routed through a corporate relay designed to hide identities. Wade wasn't just a desperate father trying to cash in on insurance money. He was taking specific instructions from someone with the kind of technical tradecraft you don't learn from corporate fraud seminars. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether we'd catch Keith Mercer. It was whether the person on the other end of that Nevada line knew my name yet, and if they did, what they planned to do about it. I walked to that table, and the family I built from choice, instead of blood, made room for me. The room was lit entirely by the amber glow of dying oak logs. When Ivy looked up from her paper folding and asked, Dad, out of everything the notebooks showed you, what's the most important rule you keep post-dinner, Christmas Eve evening? Howard snoring softly in the heavy wingback chair near the hearth, one hand still resting on his empty wineglass. Ruth leaning back on the sofa with a tea mug, eyes half-closed, content. Brennan and Ivy sitting cross-legged on the hearthrug, watching the embers pulse orange and red. Ivy's eyes reflected the firelight, waiting for my answer with the same patient focus she brought to everything testimony ornament-making documenting her brother's recycling failures in her blue leather notebook. I looked at 3 generations occupying the floor around this hearth. Not a calculation, I pulled off a spreadsheet in a hurry. Real people, real safety, real home. 3 distinct entries, I said finally. First, always document the pattern. If a sequence feels structurally broken, it's usually because someone is forcing the numbers. Never wait for the explosion before allowing yourself to trust the alignment. Brennan shifted slightly, recognizing the echo of conversations we'd had about the blue notebook, about the 12 lines that tracked his poisoning before I had enough evidence to act. Second evidence is vital for court, but home doesn't require baseline proof to be real. I spent 30 years tracking human failure through bank transactions. It took 9 days sitting on a hard wooden bench in a hospital corridor to understand that the things holding life together can't be measured by any tool the government ever handed me. The fire popped, sending sparks against the screen. Outside, snow continued falling in that steady, silent way that transforms everything. Third, I didn't choose the man who tried to clear Brennan's account, but I chose Brennan. I chose Ivy. Third, I didn't choose the man who tried to clear Brennan's account, but I chose Brennan. I chose Ivy. That's the only signature that remains valid on the deed. That's the only signature that remains valid on the deed. 30 years I spent documenting human failure through bank transactions. 9 days on a wooden hospital bench taught me that the things holding life together can't be measured by any tool the government ever handed me. And it took 60 years to understand that the most important accounting doesn't happen in ledgers. It happens in moments like this, with snow falling outside and family safe inside. Ivy nodded slowly, absorbing the words like she was adding them to her own notebook. Brennan stared into the fire, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. Ruth lifted her teacup toward my chair. To Eugene Hartley, the most stubborn auditor the state ever turned loose. Howard opened one eye, his voice a low rumble, without moving from his reclined position. The only one who ever managed to turn a tax investigation into a home. A quiet laugh rippled through the room. Not the explosive kind, just the warm acknowledgement of truth, wrapped in affection. I lifted my glass toward the frosted window where snow pressed against the panes. To people who pick up the line at 2:47 in the morning, the glasses clinked softly. The fire settled lower. Outside, Portland disappeared under white silence. Late Christmas Eve, 10:15 p.m. Howard and Ruth had cleared the driveway carefully, their tail lights vanishing into white fog 40 minutes ago. Ivy's bedroom light had slipped dark at 10. The house held that particular quiet that comes after good meals and honest conversation. I stepped onto the front porch, wearing Margaret's old heavy wool cardigan, the last piece of her needlework, made for deep cold, still carrying the faint scent of cedar from the closet where it had waited 5 years. The screen door clicked open behind me. Brennan stepped out, boots crunching fresh snow on the porch boards, and took his place at my left elbow, without a word. We stood side by side, breath pluming in the freezing air, watching snowflakes drop across Portland roofs in the yellow halo of street lamps. Silent for 3 long minutes, just the sound of our breathing and the distant hush of snow accumulating on branches. "Dad," Brennan's voice was quiet, deliberate. "Thank you for answering the phone that night. 1 year ago tonight at 2:47 in the morning, I got a phone call that tore my world apart. Tonight, I'm standing on the porch with my son watching snowfall, and the ledger is finally balanced. Did you honestly think an old auditor like me was going to let an account stay out of balance, son?" Brennan's face broke into a quiet, easy smile, the kind that takes a year to earn back after the world falls apart. We stood together in the cold shoulders, brushing, watching the winter light hold against the dark. Ledger balanced, numbers clear, story finally exactly where it belongs. The snow fell heavier, now thick flakes that stuck and built, transforming the familiar street into something clean and new. The craftsman house behind us glowed warm through frosted windows. Margaret's string lights still working after 20 years. Ivy's handmade ornaments visible on the small corner tree. The smell of rosemary and apple pie still lingering in rooms that had almost been emptied by poison and betrayal. But they weren't empty. They were full with 2 children who'd survived what no one should have to survive, with friends who'd helped build the case that saved them, with the kind of ordinary evening that looks unremarkable from the outside but costs everything to protect. I pulled the wool cardigan tighter against the cold. Brennan shifted his weight boots, crunching snow, but didn't move to go inside. "We should probably get out of this weather," he said finally. "Probably," I agreed. Neither of us moved. Because some moments need to be held a little longer. Because a year ago this family didn't exist, and tonight it does. Because the journey from crisis to home is measured not in miles, but in phone calls, answered evidence gathered, adoption papers filed, and dinners shared around tables that hold more love than blood ever guaranteed. Because there are some people in this life who will always pick up the line at 3 in the morning, no matter how heavy the storm gets. That isn't an obligation on a spreadsheet. That is just what a father does. And to you listening to my story, remember this. For 30 years, I thought being a good father meant providing security and teaching discipline. I thought I'd done my job when Wade graduated, got married, started his career. I almost missed the signs that my grandson was being poisoned because I'd stopped watching. Don't make my mistake. The people you love most are the ones who need your attention, not your assumptions. The lesson I learned is this family isn't defined by DNA. Some might call this a dad revenge story, but to me, it was about choosing family protecting a child when those who should have loved him decided $13 million mattered more. When your instincts tell you something's wrong in your family, trust that warning. Document what you see. Move carefully, but move. I believe God gave us those instincts for a reason, and sometimes protecting the people we love means refusing to look away when the pattern breaks. If this story resonated with you, I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my position? Please consider sharing this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about Dad, Revenge Family, and the hard choices we make to protect the people we love, subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A final reminder, while this story contains fictionalized elements for reflection and storytelling, the lessons about family trust and protection are real. Take care of the people who depend on you, watch for the patterns, and never stop being the person who answers at 2:47 in the morning. I arrived at the OHSU 4th floor ICU corridor at exactly 7 in the morning on day 1, carrying the faded blue wool watch cap Margaret had knit for Brennan when he was 8 years old, the one he wore every winter until Wade told him it looked too cheap for their Lake Oswego neighborhood. The oak bench sat directly across from his locked door. I sat down, the cap resting on my knees, and I didn't knock. I didn't send texts through the nurses' station. I didn't ask staff to advocate on my behalf. This is the second fundamental skill of a senior IRS investigator. Long after you master tracking numbers, you must master the art of waiting. Waiting for the room to cool. Waiting when the target is unready to face truth. An IRS audit can take 18 months to complete. Not because the numbers are complicated, but because human beings need time to stop constructing defenses and start accepting what the ledger has been saying all along. I knew what I was doing on that oak bench. I was giving my grandson the one thing 17 years of manipulation had never allowed him time to read the evidence without anyone forcing the conclusion. The floor nurse walked past at noon. "Can I bring you something, Mr. Hartley?" she asked quietly. "Coffee, a meal tray?" I shook my head. At 4 in the afternoon, when shift change began, I stood up. I carefully folded the wool cap into a neat square and left it resting on the bench, directly facing his door. Then I walked to the elevators and went home. When I stepped off the elevator at 7 the following morning, day 2, the bench was entirely clear, but through the narrow glass slit in Brennan's door, visible in the pale morning light, the cap sat on the small bedside table inside the room, folded into a perfect, neat square, not discarded, taken in and kept. The first hairline crack in the wall he'd built. I sat back down on the bench and let myself exhale. Day 2, mid-afternoon. Ruth found me in the corridor and gestured toward the stairwell. I followed her down one flight to her cramped third-floor office. She closed the door. 6 weeks ago, she said without preamble, when you first logged that Wednesday-Friday pattern and shared your notes with me over coffee, I didn't just listen, Eugene. I called Howard. I leaned forward. Under your legal authorization as deed holder, she continued, Howard entered the Lake Oswego house under the guise of repairing a leaking valve. He installed a video-only micro-lens camera into the molding above the kitchen island. No audio. Strictly within Oregon property owner recording statutes. You've had footage for 6 weeks. Encrypted drive, she said. I hand-delivered it to Detective Foster the night we brought Ivy out. I kept a copy. I thought you should see it before the trial starts. She opened her laptop and pressed play. The footage was clinical. High-angle view from the kitchen molding. 12 separate mornings skipped across the screen every Wednesday and Friday documented. In each clip, Colleen stood alone at the quartz kitchen island. The timestamp read between 6:45 and 7 a.m. She pulled a dark dropper bottle from her designer tote and methodically counted out liquid doses into Brennan's insulated morning flask. Calm, unhurried, precise. She never looked toward the doors, never glanced over her shoulder, never hesitated. Her face showed the expression of someone who had repeated an action so many times it had become simple morning routine. 12 separate entries, twice every week, methodical. The footage was entirely silent, but the images required no translation. I had reviewed thousands of hours of surveillance footage in my 30 years with the government white-collar criminals, destroying documents, money launderers conducting transactions, corporate frauds, coaching witnesses. But watching my daughter-in-law count poison drops into my grandson's breakfast flask, like she was measuring out vitamins, was the first time I understood that some evidence leaves scars that case files can never capture. I closed the laptop shell down slowly. The grand jury will see this next week, Ruth said. It's airtight. Her defense won't survive the first day. I nodded, but I couldn't find words. Ruth slid a secondary printed sheet across her desk blotter, her thumb covering the top header line. There's a financial footprint attached to the source of that dropper bottle. Eugene, she said quietly, the state police haven't run it through the grand jury yet. I wanted you to see the ledger first. I looked at the covered header and knew before she lifted her thumb that the trail was going to lead somewhere I hadn't mapped yet, because Ruth's eyes held the kind of caution that comes right before you tell an investigator that the conspiracy goes deeper than the original indictment. She lifted her thumb. The header read ATM Deposit Analysis. Keith Allen Mercer, OHSU Night Shift Pharmacy. Below it a column of dates and dollar amounts. 8 separate cash deposits over 12 weeks. Irregular intervals. Odd denominations. The kind of pattern that screams structured transactions designed to avoid reporting thresholds. Total $9,600. Keith Mercer. I said the name unfamiliar. Night shift pharmacist, Ruth said. Access to the controlled substance vault. No oversight between midnight and 6 a.m. I looked at the deposit dates and cross-referenced them mentally against the pattern in my blue notebook. Every cash deposit lined up within 48 hours of one of Brennan's illnesses. Colleen paid him to steal the thallium, I said. Ruth nodded. And Detective Foster is moving on him tomorrow morning. The Nevada number stayed with me through day 6 and into the morning of day 7. But before Mercer's arrest, Detective Foster had one more priority that required my presence in person. I stood in the darkened observation alcove behind the two-way mirror, watching my 12-year-old granddaughter sit perfectly straight in the juvenile interview chair, her shoulders squared back in unconscious mimicry of the posture I'd kept my entire life, and the sight caused a hard knot to form in my throat. The room on the other side of the glass was designed specifically for children. Soft lighting, neutral beige walls, a table without sharp corners. Denise Monroe, the state-appointed child advocate, sat within arm's reach of Ivy, providing the mandatory protective buffer Oregon law requires for juvenile witnesses in felony proceedings. Glenn Fletcher, Colleen's lead defense attorney, stood at the back of the observation alcove beside me, with the practiced dismissiveness of a man who had made a career out of discrediting vulnerable witnesses. Detective Foster sat across from Ivy in the interview room, her voice gentle but professional. Can you tell me about the last morning you saw your brother before he went to the hospital? Ivy's voice was steady, clear, no hesitation. Mom was in the kitchen by herself. It was really early, maybe 6:45. She had Brennan's water flask on the counter, the silver one he takes to school. And she had a small, dark bottle, brown glass with a dropper cap. She counted the drops very carefully. 1, 2, 3. Then I asked if I could taste the vitamins too, and she turned around really fast. Her face looked different than I'd ever seen. Different how? Foster asked quietly. like she was angry but also scared, and then she grabbed my arm really hard and told me to go back upstairs. Glenn Fletcher shifted beside me, his leather briefcase making a soft sound against the observation rail. "Detective," he said loud enough for the speaker system to carry his voice into the interview room. "The child is clearly experiencing trauma-induced memory distortion. Children frequently manufacture physical confrontations when police disrupt their home environment." Ivy's head turned slightly toward the mirror, as if she could see through the reflective glass to where we stood in the darkness. "I'm 12 years old, sir," she said, her voice carrying the same precise tone I'd used in 1,000 depositions. "I know exactly what my mother did, and I know a fall doesn't leave fingers on your skin. I had reviewed thousands of witness testimonies in my 30 years, with the government cooperating witnesses. Hostile targets, frightened civilians caught in financial schemes they didn't understand. But standing behind that two-way glass, watching my 12-year-old granddaughter calmly defend her own credibility against a defense attorney's dismissal, that was the first time in 3 decades that I had to grip the observation rail to keep my hands from shaking." Inside the interview room, Ivy didn't wait for the advocate's permission. She reached down with her right hand, grabbed the hem of her soft blue sweater sleeve, and pulled it up to her shoulder in one deliberate motion. The bruise was perfect, clinical, unmistakable. 5 distinct pressure points where an adult hand had gripped hard enough to rupture capillaries through a 12-year-old's skin. 4 fingers wrapped around the outside of her upper arm. 1 thumb pressed into the inside, the spacing exact, the color deep purple fading to yellow at the edges. The observation room behind the glass fell completely silent. Glenn Fletcher's legal pad dropped an inch. Detective Foster's jaw set so hard I could see the muscle twitch even through the two-way mirror. I looked down at my own hands, my knuckles white against the iron railing. A financial fraud that leaves its fingerprints bruised into a child's skin. I still didn't have a name for that. The interview concluded. Detective Foster said, her voice flat and professional, masking what I knew was the same rage I felt burning in my chest. "Ms. Monroe, please escort the witness to the Family Services Coordinator." Glenn Fletcher left the observation alcove without another word. The next afternoon, day 6, 4 o'clock. Detective Foster met me at a corner diner 2 blocks from the sheriff's station. Rain drummed against the plate glass windows, and the smell of old coffee and bacon grease filled the narrow booth. She slid a thick manila folder across the laminate table. "Wade's formal interrogation transcript from the secure detention wing," she said. "Colleen's attorneys released a statement yesterday afternoon painting Wade as a violent, unstable gambler who coerced her participation under domestic duress." He read it in his cell. 30 minutes later, he was asking for the prosecutor. I opened the folder. 43 pages of single-spaced text. Wade's confession typed in clean courier font. Every operational detail, every timeline marker, every financial transaction. "Colleen was the absolute architect," Foster said, her coffee mug sitting untouched between us. "She researched thallium's delayed reaction profile. She drafted the timeline. She created the fake San Francisco summit coordinates. She contacted Keith Mercer and negotiated the pharmaceutical access. Wade's role was purely operational drowning in $2.1 million in debt to the Volkov network. The Nevada number that called you, that's their collection enforcement line. They gave Wade an ultimatum: liquidate assets immediately, or they'd start targeting Ivy next. Is there a meaningful moral difference between the person who designs the murder and the person who executes it, because they're too weak to find another way out of their debts? He didn't start out as a monster. Eugene," Foster said, quietly watching my face. "He was just a weak man who let his debts run so far ahead of him that he forgot the names of his own children." I sat in that diner booth and listened to the rain beat against the glass. Wade's transcript opened before me, documenting every detail of his collapse. The gambling debt. The Nevada phone number calling in the weeks before the poisoning began. Colleen's cold architectural precision designing a murder timeline around a trust fund activation date. Detective Foster was right. Wade didn't start as a monster. But I knew what 30 years of investigation had taught me about weakness. It doesn't absolve the crime. It just explains why some people become the exact tools that evil needs to function. "Keith Mercer," I said, closing the folder. "Tomorrow morning," Foster said. "Parking structure, 6:30 a.m. We move the second his car clears the barrier." I nodded. The rain kept falling, and somewhere in the secure detention wing, my son was learning what it meant to trade your children's lives for a chance at erasing debts you should have walked away from years ago. Tomorrow came with fog. The mist rolled off the Willamette River at dawn on day 7, dense and freezing, turning the OHSU employee parking structure into a landscape of amber halos and wet concrete. And somewhere in that gray pre-dawn light, a man who thought he'd gotten away with selling poison was about to learn that retired IRS agents never stop counting. I sat in my F-150 at the far side of the deck engine off, watching the ticket barrier at the entrance ramp. Keith Mercer's sedan cleared the barrier at exactly 6:30 a.m. Detective Foster and 2 state troopers moved in before he could reach the pharmacy floor or access the vault systems. They stopped him mid-lane, 3 vehicles forming a triangle that left no exit path. Keith didn't run. That told me everything I needed to know about his guilt-innocent men fight. Guilty men who've been carrying the weight too long just want it to end. He stood by his open car door, looked around the empty concrete deck with a slow, exhausted sweep of his head, like a man who had been waiting for this shadow to fall for months, and quietly extended his wrists for the steel cuffs. No attorney demand, no resistance, no denials, just the tired surrender of someone who'd been paid to forget his conscience and couldn't sleep anymore. Within 2 hours of booking, Keith surrendered the complete timeline in exchange for a recommended minimum sentence. Colleen had approached him 8 weeks prior with $9,600 in crisp bundled cash for unmonitored thallium draw and precise dosage schedule, designed to mimic chronic organ failure. He knew what the chemical was for. Did it anyway. His mortgage was in default. Another weak man who became evil's operational tool. The second fundamental skill of a senior IRS investigator isn't just tracking numbers, it's mastering the art of waiting. Waiting for the room to cool. Waiting when the target is unready to face truth. Waiting without letting your panic speak louder than the evidence. I had waited 9 days on that oak bench, because I knew what 30 years of audits had taught me: you can't force a human being to accept what their ledger says until they're ready to read the final line themselves. Day 9, 9 o'clock in the morning. Under formal discovery, rules, the state prosecutor cleared the initial certified evidence file for immediate family release. Detective Foster called me from the courthouse. "The binder is ready," she said. "I want Ruth to deliver it, not you." I understood immediately. "If I carry those pages in," I said, "he'll see it as manipulation. If Ruth delivers them, it's just Oregon telling him the truth." Exactly. I sat on that oak bench with the wool cap on my knees and waited. Ruth arrived at 9:15 carrying a gray cardboard binder, thick enough to document a federal case. She gave me one brief nod, silent acknowledgement of what we were about to set in motion, and stepped past the threshold of room 412 without a word. The door closed behind her with a soft click. 15 minutes ticked by, then 30. The corridor was quiet except for the distant hum of medical equipment and the occasional soft footstep of nurses completing rounds. Then from behind the heavy wood door a sound broke through the sterile silence. Low, unchecked sobbing. The sound of a 17-year-old boy reading mathematical proof of his parents' treachery. I didn't move. I didn't knock. I just sat there with my hands folded over the blue wool cap and let him have the space to break. The crying inside the room subsided into a long silence. Then came the sound of movement, not the heavy stride of a nurse, but a light, hesitating step against the linoleum. The brass handle of room 412 slowly began to turn. I stood, but it wasn't Brennan who pulled the door open. It was Ivy. The 12-year-old girl looked up at me with those sharp eyes that had watched her mother count poison drops and lived to testify. She didn't say a word. She just reached out, took my rough hand in her small fingers, and silently guided me across the threshold to her brother's bedside. Brennan looked up from the scattered forensic audit sheets on his lap. His shoulders were shaking. His face was pale. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. He didn't offer a dramatic apology for the months of anger and rejection. He looked me straight in the eye and spoke 4 quiet words that carried more weight than every legal document in the state files combined. "Grandpa, I read it." I stepped forward, took the chair beside the mattress, and reached down. Margaret had spent 3 weeks sourcing that specific yarn because she said the blue matched the exact color of Brennan's eyes when he laughed, and placing it into his hands at that moment felt like closing a circle that started 17 years ago, when she first held him as an infant and promised him he'd always have a home. I placed the old blue wool watch cap directly into his hands. Neither of us said anything else. Sometimes the numbers clear the ledger balances, and any additional words are just noise. Ivy slid onto the edge of the mattress, squeezing into the narrow space between her brother and my sleeve, her arms looping around the old stuffed bear she'd been clutching since the night we brought her out of Lake Oswego. She looked up at the ceiling monitor tracking Brennan's vitals, then back at my face with those eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. So what happens to the house now, Grandpa? I looked at the two of them sitting there in that hospital room, one boy who'd survived being murdered by spreadsheet, one girl who'd survived by refusing to be silent, and realized that the legal battle was over, but the actual work of building a home was just getting started. The house is mine, I said quietly. Always has been. Wade never transferred the deed, so it stays exactly where it belongs with family. Brennan's fingers tightened around the blue wool cap. Ivy's head settled against my shoulder, and for the first time since the 2:47 a.m. phone call that tore everything apart, I let myself believe that the three of us might actually make it through this intact. 3 months passed in the careful work of building routines that felt like home. Brennan moved into the guest room with the north-facing windows. Ivy took the smaller room by the stairs. We learned each other's rhythms, coffee at 6, breakfast at 7, the blue notebook sitting on my desk like a retired soldier's medal that nobody needed to explain. Then March arrived, and with it the trial. The heavy wooden courtroom doors swung open, and for the first time in 3 months, I saw my son in an orange jumpsuit. Multnomah County Courthouse. Grand oak-paneled courtroom with high ceilings and arched windows that let in the gray Portland light, the kind of room built to make justice feel permanent and inescapable. Wade entered first, flanked by 2 deputies, gaunt, hollow-eyed, the expensive suits and corporate confidence stripped away to reveal what had been underneath, all along a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Colleen followed, spine straight and face expressionless. Even in County Orange, she moved with the controlled precision of someone who refused to give an inch of ground to circumstance. I sat in the front row of the gallery, Brennan at my right hand, Ivy at my left, Ruth and Howard directly behind us, their presence a quiet wall of support. The state prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd put away worse people than these, stood and faced the bench. The people of Oregon versus Wade Eugene Hartley and Colleen Marie Hartley. She said, her voice carrying through the still courtroom. Attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud in the first degree, insurance fraud, criminal child endangerment. Wade stared at his lap. Colleen met my eyes across the courtroom and held them for 3 long seconds. Then she leaned slightly toward Wade and whispered something I couldn't hear from where I sat. But Brennan could. He was closer, and his hearing was sharper than mine. Later he'd tell me what she said. Don't look at him. He wants you to break. 32 years ago, I held that boy in the delivery room, Margaret's hand in mine, Wade's first cry splitting the air, the weight of him in my arms impossibly small and perfect. Now I was watching the state try to lock him away for life. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and old wood and recycled air, but underneath it all I caught something else. Industrial laundry detergent from the county jail uniforms. Wade used to smell like expensive cologne and coffee. Now he smelled like incarceration. Trial day 2. The bailiff called my name, and I stood from the gallery and walked to the witness box. The Bible felt heavier than it should have. The oath felt like something I'd been preparing to say for 8 years. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. The state prosecutor stood and approached the witness box with a legal pad and the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing your case is airtight. Mr. Hartley, can you state your professional background for the record? 30 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, I said. Specialized in white-collar fraud, money laundering, and financial conspiracy cases. And you're here today testifying about your own family. Yes. She walked me through it. Every document, every timeline, every transaction. The insurance policy Colleen took out on Brennan in May 2023, $5 million, with Wade listed as sole beneficiary. The forged trust documents Wade created in July, attempting to establish early access to Margaret's $8 million estate. The cash withdrawals that matched Keith Mercer's ATM Deposits down to 3-hour windows. The thallium purchase timeline cross-referenced with Brennan's hospital admissions. In your expert opinion, Mr. Hartley, does the timing of these financial instruments indicate premeditation? I looked at the jury, 12 faces watching me with varying degrees of attention and skepticism. In 30 years of white-collar investigations, I've seen hundreds of fraud schemes, I said. Some are opportunistic. Someone sees a chance and takes it. But this wasn't that. This was methodical. The insurance policy was the trigger. The trust forgery was the cover story. The structured cash payments were operational security. They planned this for months. The defense attorney stood a man in an expensive suit who'd made his career defending people who could afford his rates. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Hartley is clearly emotionally compromised. This is his son and his grandson we're discussing. How can we trust his testimony when his personal investment in the outcome is absolute? How many fraud cases had I dismantled in 30 years? 304, I'd sat in witness boxes from Seattle to San Diego, walked juries through money trails that looked exactly like this one. But I'd never imagined I'd be doing it to save my grandson from my own son. The judge looked at me. Mr. Hartley, do you believe your personal relationship affects your ability to testify objectively about the financial evidence? Your Honor. I said it's precisely because this is my son that I know how smart he is. Wade didn't make mistakes. He made choices. Every transaction I've described is documented in the evidence record. If the defense wants to challenge the financial analysis, they're welcome to bring their own expert. But they can't call me biased just because I followed the money. The judge nodded. Objection overruled. Continue. The cross-examination lasted another 40 minutes. The defense attorney tried every angle grief-driven persecution family vendetta, investigative overreach. I remained unshaken. Every question I cited the case file. Every challenge I referenced forensic standards. When the judge finally released me from the witness box, I stood and walked down the 3 steps to the courtroom floor. I had to pass the defense table to reach the gallery. As I drew level with Colleen, she leaned forward slightly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet courtroom, I heard every word. I underestimated you. I didn't break stride, didn't turn my head, kept my eyes forward. Everyone does, I said quietly. Then I walked back to the front row and sat down between my grandchildren, and we waited for the prosecution to call its next witness. The overhead lights dimmed, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete I could hear the bailiffs breathing 3 rows back. The state calls trial day 3 to order, the prosecutor announced, his voice cutting through the darkness. We now present Exhibit 47. A projection screen descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whir. I watched from the witness gallery as the defense table shifted. Glenn Fletcher leaning forward, Colleen's posture. Rigid, Wade's head bowed. The first clip appeared timestamp, March 13th, 2024, 6:47 a.m. The kitchen at Lake Oswego materialized in crystalline high definition the quartz island, gleaming under recessed lighting. For 3 seconds the frame remained empty. Then Colleen entered from the left, designer tote bag slung over one shoulder, still wearing her running clothes. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone executing a familiar routine. The tote went onto the counter. Her hand disappeared inside and emerged holding a small dropper bottle, the kind you'd buy at a pharmacy for essential oils or homeopathic remedies. Brennan's silver flask sat on the island where he always left it before school. She unscrewed the cap, 5 drops from the bottle. She counted each one with her lips moving silently, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then she screwed the cap back on the flask, returned the bottle to her tote, and walked out of frame. The entire sequence took 41 seconds. No audio on this footage, the prosecutor said, but watch the pattern. The second clip played March 15th, 7:02 a.m. Same kitchen, same tote bag, same dropper bottle, same 5 drops. Then March 18th, March 20th, March 22nd. Every Wednesday and Friday morning for 6 weeks, the ritual never varied. Colleen alone in that kitchen, measuring death into my grandson's water supply with the calm focus of someone following a recipe. I'd stood in that kitchen dozens of times, Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings. The awkward small talk while Wade grilled steaks on the back patio. Had she been counting doses while I was asking about her consulting work, measuring thallium while I was helping Brennan with his calculus homework at that same island? The clips continued. March 25th, March 27th, March 29th, each Wednesday and Friday without fail, even when Wade's calendar showed him working late at the firm. Even when their anniversary dinner reservation appeared on the credit card statement for the same evening. The 12th clip ended April 8th at 6:53 a.m. The screen froze on Colleen's retreating form, tote bag over her shoulder, her reflection visible in the kitchen window. Expression calm, shoulders. Relaxed, the posture of someone who just completed a mundane chore. Objection. Glenn Fletcher was on his feet, his voice sharp enough to make the court reporter flinch. Your Honor, this footage was obtained from a hidden camera, installed without my client's knowledge or consent. This is a clear violation of privacy rights under Oregon law. The prosecutor turned slowly, and I saw the trap close. The camera was installed by the property owner, Your Honor. Eugene Hartley purchased the Lake Oswego house in 2003 and never removed his name from the deed. Under Oregon Revised Statute 163.700, property owners have the legal right to install security systems in their own homes, even when those homes are occupied by tenants. Glenn Fletcher's jaw tightened. The defendants were family members, not tenants, who paid no rent and signed no lease. The prosecutor interrupted. Mr. Hartley allowed his son to live there as a courtesy. He maintained ownership. The camera was legal. Judge Morrison adjusted her glasses, reviewing the statute on her monitor. The courtroom held its breath. 30 seconds passed. 40. Objection overruled, she said finally. The footage stands. Proceed. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions at this time. The screen went dark. The overhead lights rose slowly, and reality reasserted itself in gradual increments. The wooden pews, the state seal behind the judge's bench, the jury box, where 12 faces registered varying degrees of horror and disgust. I'd seen that footage 4 times before this moment. Once in Ruth's office when she first showed me the surveillance results, once during my preparation session with the prosecutor's team, once during the pretrial hearing, and now. Each viewing should have dulled the impact. It didn't. The courtroom smelled like stale coffee and nerves, and something else the ozone scent, that projection equipment, leaves in enclosed spaces sharp and metallic and somehow appropriate for a day spent watching someone poison a child in high definition. I forced my attention back to the defense table. Wade sat motionless, staring at his hands. Glenn Fletcher was whispering urgently to Colleen, his expression suggesting damage control calculations. But it was Colleen who caught my focus. Her face remained perfectly composed, the same mask she'd worn through jury selection, through opening statements, through my testimony about the financial evidence. But her right hand rested flat against the mahogany table, and as I watched her thumb twitched, just once, a small involuntary spasm that lasted less than a second. Glenn Fletcher didn't notice. The prosecutor was organizing his papers, moving on to the next phase. The jury was still processing what they'd seen on that screen. But I noticed. 30 years of reading faces across interrogation tables had trained me to spot the cracks. And that thumb twitch, small unconscious, quickly suppressed, was the first visible crack in her mask. That thumb twitch stayed with me through the lunch recess. When the bailiff called the afternoon session to order, I watched that crack widen into a chasm. Ivy walked to the witness box in a light blue cardigan with her back perfectly straight, and the entire courtroom went silent. 12 years old, dark hair in a ponytail, white sneakers that didn't quite reach the floor when she sat. Denise Monroe took the seat beside her within arm's reach, protocol required. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her voice softening. Miss Hartley, you may sit behind the partition if you prefer. You don't have to look at the defendants. I don't need it, Your Honor. I'm not afraid of them anymore. The judge administered the oath. Ivy placed her hand on the Bible and repeated the words without hesitation. My granddaughter is 12 years old, and she's braver than half the white-collar defendants I interrogated in 30 years. The state prosecutor approached carefully. Ivy, can you tell the jury what you saw on the morning of April 8th? I was in the kitchen doing homework. Colleen came in from her run. She didn't see me at first. What did you see your stepmother doing? She was putting liquid from a brown bottle into Brennan's water flask. Ivy's voice never wavered. She counted the drops. 12 drops. She did it the same way every Wednesday and Friday morning for months. I gripped the gallery bench until my knuckles turned white. The security footage had shown 5 drops per dose. 12 drops on that final Friday double dose, final escalation. How many times did you see her do this? Maybe 20 times 30, every Wednesday and Friday since January. Did you tell anyone? Ivy's shoulders dropped. I tried to tell my dad once. He said Colleen was just adding vitamins and I was being dramatic. She's 12 years old and she's testifying against her stepmother in a murder trial, and her voice doesn't shake once. I've never been prouder. I've never been more heartbroken. The prosecutor moved through the remaining questions with precision. Ivy described the dropper bottle, the designer tote bag, the quartz island, where Brennan's flask always waited. Every answer matched the security footage. Before I tell you what Ivy revealed next, are you still with me? Comment your prediction in exactly 8 to 12 words. What do you think the defense attorney is about to uncover when he cross-examines a 12-year-old? A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. If dramatized retellings aren't for you, you're free to stop here. Glenn Fletcher rose slowly, legal pad in hand. Miss Hartley, I only have a few questions. He approached with exaggerated gentleness. Aren't you confused about the bottles? Sweetheart, children frequently confuse routine supplements under stress from family separation. Ivy stopped him mid-sentence with one long beat of eye contact. I'm 12 years old, sir. Her voice carried across the courtroom. I know the difference between a vitamin bottle and something that makes my brother bleed from his lungs. A staircase fall doesn't leave 5 fingers on your skin. She gripped her left cardigan cuff and pulled it to her shoulder. The bruise appeared under the courtroom lights, deep purple adult-sized handprint wrapping around her upper arm, 4 fingers on top thumb underneath. Someone had grabbed a child hard enough to leave marks that lasted 3 months. Glenn Fletcher's eyes dropped to his legal pad. He sat without another question. That handprint is Colleen's. I know her hand size from the medical intake forms. She grabbed my granddaughter hard enough to leave bruises that lasted through arrest arraignment and 3 months of trial preparation. Trial day 4 started with word spreading through the courthouse corridor. Colleen was pleading out. Not remorse, calculation. The kitchen footage and Ivy's testimony had made conviction mathematically certain. Life without parole versus 40 years, with release possibility at 72. Colleen executed her plea allocation in chambers, confirmed mastermind position, validated the cash pipeline to Keith Mercer, authenticated the chemical trail. She didn't break. She calculated angles even from the defense table, still playing odds, still searching for the best available deal in a game she'd already lost. How does a father process the knowledge that his son tried to murder his grandson because the boy wasn't biologically his? What kind of man looks at a 17-year-old kid he's raised since infancy and decides death is preferable to divorce? I sat outside the clerk's office while the plea paperwork processed. Detective Foster found me 20 minutes later, 2 coffees in hand, her expression carefully neutral. 25 years, Foster said. Colleen confirmed everything we had. In exchange for her full cooperation, the prosecutor recommended a reduced sentence. Wade's sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. I nodded. We'd expected the plea? Foster hesitated, and I recognized the pause, the same one I'd used 100 times when delivering news that would upend someone's understanding of a case. There's something else, she said finally. Colleen confirmed Wade found Brennan's medical records in July of 2023. The DNA non-match. That's when they started planning. The courthouse corridor tilted. He found out Brennan wasn't his biological son, so he decided to kill him for the insurance money instead of just walking away. Revenge for the biological fraud combined with financial opportunism. Foster's voice stayed clinical. Wade felt betrayed. The insurance policy and trust fund made murder more profitable than divorce. I stared at the scuffed tile floor. 17 years of birthday parties and baseball games and homework help, and none of it mattered the moment Wade discovered Brennan didn't share his DNA. Foster shifted her weight, and I caught the warning in her posture before she spoke again. There's a secondary legal issue heading toward probate court next week. Her expression was guarded careful, like she was delivering bad news in installments. About the trust fund's biological verification requirements. You should prepare for that conversation. The floor shifted beneath me. Colleen and Wade were locked away, but the DNA storm was just beginning. The DNA storm arrived exactly 1 week later, but first came the gavel. The judge looked down at the sentencing memorandum and read the first number into the record 25 years without the possibility of parole. Trial day, 5, late afternoon. March sun slipping low over the West Hills orange bars, falling across the packed benches. The courtroom smelled like old wood and bitter coffee and the accumulated tension of 5 days watching a family tear itself apart in slow motion. Judge Morrison adjusted her reading glasses. Wade Eugene Hartley, having been found guilty of attempted premeditated murder in the first-degree child endangerment and conspiracy to commit murder. This court sentences you to 40 years in the Oregon Department of Corrections without the possibility of parole. Wade sat motionless at the defense table, staring at his lap. Orange jumpsuit wrists shackled to the table chain, the posture of someone who'd stopped fighting. Colleen Marie Hartley, pursuant to your plea agreement and full cooperation with the prosecution, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years, maximum security, with possibility of release consideration after 20 years served. Colleen stood perfectly straight-faced, expressionless. Even now, even here, she refused to break. Keith Allen Mercer, you are sentenced to 8 years with lifetime revocation of pharmaceutical licensure. 3 numbers. 3 lives measured in concrete and steel and decades that would pass while the rest of us aged outside those walls. 40 years. Wade will be 78 if he lives to see the gate. Colleen will be 60 when she's first eligible for review. They tried to kill my grandson for $13 million in a DNA secret they couldn't forgive. And now they'll spend what remains of their productive years in 6x8 cells. I sat in the gallery with Brennan on my right, Ivy on my left, Ruth and Howard 3 rows back. The courtroom felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly small. The gavel struck the sounding block once, twice, 3 times final punctuation on 5 days of testimony and 20 years of failure I'd carry forever. The courtroom erupted in low murmur. Bailiffs moved toward the defense table. Wade rose slowly, shoulders hunched. Colleen turned once to scan the gallery, her eyes passing over us without recognition or regret, and then they were walking toward the side door in their orange jumpsuits. I felt movement beside me, Brennan's hand crossing the 6 inches of gallery bench between us. His palm settled flat over mine, warm and steady. He hasn't initiated physical contact with me since he was 8 years old. I don't say anything. I don't look at him. I just turn my hand palm up and hold on. Brennan's grip tightens once acknowledgement forgiveness, something I don't have words for yet. The side door closes. Wade and Colleen disappear into the custody corridor. The judge thanks the jury and dismisses them. People begin gathering coats and bags, the slow shuffle of a courtroom, emptying after verdict. Brennan's hand on mine feels like forgiveness I don't deserve yet. I failed to protect him for 17 years. I let him live in that house with 2 people who were methodically killing him. And now he's reaching across the wreckage to tell me it's okay. We stand together, me, Brennan, Ivy. Ruth and Howard join us in the aisle. Nobody speaks. There's nothing left to say that hasn't been said in testimony and evidence, and 5 days of watching my son's life end in increments. Outside on the courthouse granite steps, downtown traffic hums through the late afternoon. The sun feels too warm for March, the air too clean after 5 days breathing recycled courtroom atmosphere. The stone steps radiate stored heat through my shoes. People disperse in slow waves. Journalists, court staff, the handful of observers who'd followed the case from opening statements. I'm buttoning my coat when I notice the silver-haired man approaching from the thinning crowd. He's about 55, weathered face flannel shirt under a canvas jacket. I'd seen him in the back row all 5 days, but never caught his name. He extends a weathered hand. Mr. Hartley, I'm Thomas Bellamy. I sat in the back row for all 5 days. I wanted to shake your hand. I take his hand uncertain. Brennan and Ivy stand at my shoulders. Ruth and Howard 3 steps below. You knew Wade? I ask carefully. Thomas's jaw tightens. He destroyed my sister 5 years ago. Offshore investment scheme wiped out her entire retirement. She lost everything. Fell below federal indictment thresholds, so nobody prosecuted. She didn't survive the winter. The afternoon sun feels suddenly colder. My sister was a school teacher. Thomas continues, voice quiet but steady. 32 years in Portland public schools. She trusted Wade because he came recommended by someone at her church. He took $400,000, her whole pension, and it vanished into shell companies in the Caymans. By the time we figured out what happened, he'd restructured everything. The FBI said the case was too small, too complicated, not enough evidence for prosecution. How many others did Wade destroy before he came for Brennan? How many quiet victims fell below federal thresholds, lost everything and disappeared into obituaries? Nobody connected back to my son. She stopped sleeping, Thomas says, stopped eating, moved in with me that November. By February she was gone. Heart attack, the coroner said, but I know what really killed her. I don't have adequate words. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Bellamy. Truly. Thomas nods, once a sharp downward jerk of his chin. Thank you for staying in that room, Mr. Hartley. My sister lost everything to him. She didn't survive. But standing here today knowing he'll spend 25 years in prison, at least we know it wasn't just a number that forgot her. He shakes my hand once more, nods to Brennan and Ivy, and turns toward the Max Transit stop at the corner. We watch him go, a man carrying 5 years of grief who'd spent 5 days in a courtroom watching someone else's justice play out, because his own never came. Brennan breaks the silence, his voice carrying the half-curious, half-awed tone of someone processing scale. Did you have their files, too, Dad? I shake my head. No, but I'm glad we cleared the ledger for them. We cleared the ledger for Thomas Bellamy's sister and whoever else Wade destroyed along the way. 2 weeks later, the ledger came for us. Brennan's pen scratched across the trust release authorization, and I watched my 18-year-old grandson sign his name on the line where Margaret's estate becomes his. April 2024. 2 weeks post-verdict. The law office sat 14 floors above Southwest Broadway, mahogany boardroom table, polished to mirror shine Portland rain, streaking the windows in diagonal lines. Attorney Harrington spread the trust charter documents across the table, thick cream paper, Margaret's signature still visible in faded ink from 18 years ago. Standard anti-fraud language in high-value estates. Harrington said, adjusting his wireframe glasses. Mid-50s gray suit, the measured tone of someone who'd overseen 100 trust transfers. We need DNA verification that Brennan is a biological heir of the Cole bloodline, your late wife Margaret's family line. OHSU already maintains his complete genetic profile from the criminal medical intake. We'll pull the verification match through expedited court order. Brennan looked up from the signature line. How long does that take? An hour, maybe less. Just a formality, Mr. Hartley. Sign here, and we'll have the transfer finalized by end of business. A formality. A routine box on an estate worth $8 million that would give my grandson financial security Wade and Colleen had tried to murder him for. Brennan signed the second authorization. Ivy sat beside him, quiet, still carrying the careful posture of someone who testified at a murder trial and revealed handprint bruises to a courtroom full of strangers. Harrington's clerks gathered the folios, murmured about processing times, disappeared into the corridor. The meeting concluded smoothly, routinely, the way transfers always do when nobody knows what's coming. I stepped into the reception lobby. Leather chairs, abstract art on cream walls, the muffled sound of rain against windows, and Detective Lorraine Foster was waiting near the elevator bank. Her coat was wet from Portland rain. She wasn't carrying her standard case folder. Her expression was guarded urgent, the look of someone delivering news that couldn't wait. Mr. Hartley, I need 5 minutes. Private. Foster doesn't show up unannounced at law offices unless something broke wrong. Her coat's wet, she's not carrying files, and her eyes have that careful, catastrophic look I've seen on federal agents, right before they deliver subpoenas. I followed her into a windowless side office conference table, 4 chairs, the smell of old coffee and legal paper. The door locked behind us. Foster didn't waste time on preamble. OHSU Forensic Lab ran the expedited genetic trace. The results are absolute Eugene. Brennan has no biological connection to Wade Hartley. None. The room tilted. That's not possible. Margaret entered the marriage already pregnant from a previous relationship. Foster's voice stayed level clinical, the tone she uses when delivering facts that destroy lives. She never told Wade. He only found out 4 months ago when he was checking insurance files for the trust activation. That's what triggered the poisoning scheme. Margaret kept this secret for 18 years. She looked me in the eye every Christmas, every birthday, every Sunday dinner, and never once told me that Brennan wasn't Wade's biological son. She died with that lie intact, buried it so deep that even I, 30 years reading deception across interrogation tables, never saw the crack. Wade knew for 4 months. My voice sounded distant, hollow. July 2023. he found medical records during the trust activation paperwork, ran his own DNA test. When it came back negative, he and Colleen started planning. The timeline snapped into focus. Wade discovering the paternity fraud, the rage festering through July and August, the first thallium purchase in September, the methodical poisoning starting in October. 4 months of calculated revenge, disguised as parental care. Why murder? I heard myself ask. Why not just file a paternity denial contest? The trust. Foster pulled a folded document from her coat pocket. Because of this. Survivor Contingency Clause, paragraph 12. If Wade filed paternity denial, the trust clauses would still protect Brennan as child of record equitable adoption raised from infancy. But there's a survivor contingency. If Brennan died before his 18th birthday, the principle reverts to the surviving parent. She spread the paper on the conference table. I stared at paragraph 12, the legal language cold and precise. Wade couldn't contest paternity and get the money. The trust was ironclad as long as Brennan lived. So he chose murder, I said. He chose $8 million over his son's life, over a boy he raised for 17 years. Foster refolded the document. Murder was Wade's only financial path to that trust. How do you tell an 18-year-old boy that his father tried to murder him because he found out he wasn't really his son? How do you explain that the woman who gave birth to him lied to everyone for 17 years, that his entire identity is built on foundation that never existed? The room smelled like stale coffee and rain-soaked wool, and the particular silence that follows catastrophic news. Foster moved toward the door, then stopped. Trust attorneys freeze the account the second those results clear the server. You have 20 minutes, maybe less, to tell that boy his life isn't what he thought, before Harrington walks out there and serves the freeze order. I'm sorry, Eugene. I thought you should hear it from me first. She left. The door clicked shut. I stood alone in the windowless side office for 60 seconds that felt like 60 years. 20 minutes to tell Brennan the truth. 20 minutes before the lawyers freeze the account and ask questions I can't answer. 20 minutes to destroy every certainty that boy has about who he is and where he comes from. Margaret, what the hell did you do? I reached for the door handle. But the conversation couldn't happen in a law office with lawyers listening. It needed the kind of space where family secrets get told. The fire crackled in the hearth for the first time since the 2:47 a.m. phone call in December, and I didn't know how to tell my grandson his entire life was built on a lie. Evening, my craftsman living room in northwest Portland. The brick hearth threw steady heat into the room, firelight dancing shadows across the oak table where Brennan sat across from me. Ivy was upstairs with her notebooks, giving us space without being asked. The fire sounded like it did on 1,000 Sunday nights when Margaret was alive and Wade was still my son, and Brennan was just a boy who liked model trains. I don't know how to tell him that none of it was real. Brennan, I didn't search for soft entry. The forensic lab returned the genetic verification today. Wade is not your biological father. Your mother, Margaret, was already pregnant when they married. She never told anyone. Brennan didn't move for 1 full minute, just stared into the fire, watching the oak logs collapse into amber coals. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes were level processing. How long did Wade know? 4 months. He found medical records during the trust activation paperwork last July. Ran his own DNA test. When it came back negative, he and Colleen started planning. I watched my grandson absorb the information that his father tried to kill him because he discovered he wasn't really his son. Brennan doesn't cry, doesn't shout. He just stares into the fire like he's watching his entire life rewrite itself in the coals. The clock on the mantel ticked through 20 seconds. Outside, Portland rain drummed against the windows, the same rhythm it's kept for 60 years. What does it mean for the trust? Brennan asked finally. It changes everything. I kept my voice steady. Harrington is legally bound to lock the accounts tomorrow until a probate judge reviews the bloodline clause. Could take 12 to 18 months in courts. Brennan nodded slowly, still not looking away from the fire. Then, not asking about money, Dad. Asking about the hallway. You sat on that wooden bench for 9 days while I screamed through glass. You didn't even know who my mother was. If the bloodline says I'm a stranger, does it change why you stayed? The question landed like physical force. No. My voice came out rougher than intended. It doesn't change a goddamn thing. 9 days on a wooden bench. Brennan thinks I might not have stayed if I'd known we didn't share blood, but he doesn't understand blood is the easiest part of being family. Love is what you do when the screaming doesn't stop. Margaret was my wife, I said. You're my grandson. The DNA doesn't change what we are to each other. Brennan held my gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded once. The fire popped, sending sparks against the screen. The rain continued its steady percussion, and somewhere in that silence something settled between us that didn't need more words. The following morning we returned to the law office on Southwest Broadway. The atmosphere had shifted completely from 24 hours prior. Attorney Harrington sat hunched over 3 thick legal folders, expression grim, the look of someone who'd spent the night researching statutes that offered no good options. The language in Margaret's trust is explicit biological heir of Cole bloodline. Harrington didn't waste time on pleasantries. With the DNA results entered into the criminal trial record, we have no discretionary latitude. The account must freeze pending full probate review, 12 to 18 months minimum. Harrington looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. 3 thick folders open in front of him, and every one of them said the same thing: Brennan loses. Tertiary claimants, I asked. Margaret's surviving relatives have standing to challenge. The Cole family bloodline clause was specifically designed to prevent transfer outside biological descendants. Brennan's legal position is compromised. The rain streaked the 14th floor windows in diagonal lines. The mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting. Everything looked the same as yesterday, but the entire landscape had shifted. Ivy sat beside Brennan, quiet, her hands folded on the table. Brennan stared down at his open palms against the dark wood. Harrington flipped through the reference indices citing Oregon probate statutes, with the resigned tone of someone delivering terminal diagnosis. Equitable adoption arguments have limited success in high-value estate contests. The language is ironclad. I'm sorry, Mr. Hartley. Without biological verification, Brennan's claim becomes vulnerable to— Wait! Brennan's voice cut through the legal recitation. He looked at Harrington, then at me, then back to his hands. His shoulders dropped slightly, and I recognized the posture before he even opened his mouth. I've seen it 100 times. The child who's been conditioned his entire life to believe he's an inconvenience, who learned to make himself smaller to avoid causing trouble, who absorbed every silent message that said his needs were negotiable. Brennan is about to give up $8 million, Margaret's legacy, his future, his security, because he thinks he doesn't deserve to cause trouble. It's okay. Brennan started, his voice carrying that familiar note of preemptive surrender. I don't need— Stop. I stood before he could get another syllable into the room. Brennan, don't. Harrington stopped flipping through the legal reference indices. Ivy's head came up. Brennan looked at me confused. I kept my voice level, deliberate. Harrington, I have a prior filing to discuss. Harrington looked up from the legal folders, confusion evident. Brennan's mouth was still half open, the surrender already forming. I delivered the line I'd been preparing since 3 a.m. My formal adult adoption petition regarding Brennan was filed with Multnomah County Circuit Court on January 15th, 3 months ago, while the state was organizing the criminal indictment. If the adoption decree was finalized this morning, Brennan becomes my direct lawful son, and I'm co-founder and sole surviving trustee of the Cole estate. Does immediate parental adoption satisfy the bloodline inheritance parameter under Oregon Probate Code? The boardroom went absolutely silent. Harrington stared at me for 3 full seconds. You filed in January, 3 months ago. The moment Wade and Colleen were arraigned, I knew the DNA would surface eventually during the trust activation. I wanted the legal foundation in place before anyone could challenge Brennan's claim. Brennan's expression shifted from confusion to something I couldn't quite read yet. Ivy sat perfectly still, watching. Harrington pulled a different reference volume from the stack behind him, flipped to a marked section, and cleared his throat. His fingers pressed flat against the open page. Under ORS 109.276A, finalized adult adoption establishes a legal parent-child relationship carrying absolute statutory equivalence to biological birthright for all inheritance and estate purposes. He paused, scanning the statute. Since your petition was filed in January and cleared the standard 90-day state character review, a signed finalization decree from the circuit judge this morning immediately cures the trust defect. The funds will clear to Brennan's account by noon. I watched Harrington's expression shift from confusion to comprehension to something close to admiration. He thought we were trapped. He didn't know I'd been building the exit for 3 months. The decree was signed at 8:15 this morning, I said. Before this meeting, I have the certified copy in my briefcase. Harrington sat back in his chair, a small smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Hartley, that is remarkably well planned. 30 years with IRS criminal investigation teaches you to think 3 moves ahead. I filed the adoption papers the same week Wade and Colleen were arraigned for trying to murder their son. While they sat in county lockup calculating plea deals, I was standing in the circuit court clerk's office filling out forms that would make Brennan mine. While Detective Foster was building the criminal case, I was building the legal foundation that would protect everything Margaret wanted Brennan to have. Blood doesn't make family, choice does. I reached across the mahogany table and picked up the certified DNA report that had threatened to destroy everything. Folded it twice, slid it into my breast pocket. Mr. Harrington, I filed those papers the week Wade was arraigned. That's the only date that matters. The man standing on cold concrete at 2:47 in the morning while the world falls apart, that's who a father is. Harrington nodded slowly, the professional mask slipping for just a moment. I've been practicing probate law for 32 years, Mr. Hartley. That's the best use of ORS 109.276 I've ever seen. A knock at the boardroom door interrupted the moment. A woman in her 40s entered, carrying a leather portfolio. Sarah Caldwell, probate clerk, her name badge visible on a lanyard. She'd witnessed 100 adoptions processed, 1,000 estate transfers, seen every variation of family law play out in these rooms. The adoption decree, Mr. Harrington, she said, laying the bond paper on the table. Heavy cream stock, official seal, stamp ready in her other hand. Harrington reviewed the document, once signed his verification at the bottom, and slid it toward the center of the table. Sarah pressed the silver seal into the paper with a satisfying thump that echoed in the quiet boardroom. Official, recorded, permanent. Brennan Hartley is legally my son, and no DNA test in the world can undo it. Congratulations, Sarah said quietly, gathering her portfolio. Adoption is now officially recorded with Multnomah County. Trust freeze is permanently deleted from the system. She left as efficiently as she'd arrived, closing the door with a soft click. The adoption decree sat on the wood blotter in front of Brennan, his name legally bound to mine, now the silver seal gleaming under the recessed lights. The trust fund secure, the inheritance protected. Everything Margaret wanted for him preserved. Brennan stared at the document for a long moment. His fingers traced the edge of the bond paper, but didn't pick it up. The room smelled like old leather and fresh ink and rain still streaking the windows 14 floors above Southwest Broadway. Then he looked up across the table at me. He didn't say thank you. He didn't cry. He just used the word I haven't heard with real meaning since Wade was a little boy. Dad, 1 syllable. The word I haven't heard with genuine weight in 30 years. Not Grandpa, not Eugene. Dad. The word carries everything 9 days on a wooden bench, 3 months of legal preparation, 18 years of birthday parties and baseball games that weren't mine by blood, but became mine by choice. It carries the moment I decided to fight for him instead of letting the system take him. It carries every morning since December when he sat at my kitchen table doing homework while Ivy makes toast. It's the only word that matters. Ivy slid her hand under Brennan's elbow, and for the first time since the trial started, I saw a genuine, unburdened smile on her face. 12 years old, and she testified against her stepmother, revealed bruises that lasted 3 months. Watched her family implode in a courtroom, and now she's smiling like the weight finally lifted. Can we change the mailbox name today? Ivy asked, looking at me with those serious eyes that had seen too much too young. I reached for my coat. Yeah, we can change the mailbox name today. Brennan picked up the adoption decree, folded it carefully along the official creases, and slid it into his jacket pocket. Right over his heart, where it belongs. We left Harrington's office together, a father, a son, a daughter, walking out into Portland rain that felt like baptism. The Portland rain baptized us that afternoon, and 1 week later, the past delivered its final betrayal. The encrypted FBI email arrived at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in May, and I opened it in my dark home office with only the desk lamp throwing shadows across the wall. Detective Foster had forwarded the FBI asset recovery file without commentary, just a single line. Thought you should see this before it hits the formal record. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had uncovered a private Cayman Islands offshore account registered under Colleen's sole maiden name. $847,000. 10 years of meticulous microtransfers from joint corporate accounts. Each transaction precisely calibrated to stay below regional bank alert thresholds. Colleen hadn't just been planning to murder Brennan for the trust fund. She'd been systematically siphoning Wade's business assets for a decade, building her own exit strategy long before Brennan's 18th birthday became the murder catalyst. Perfect corporate strategist undone by the exact engine she used against those children, total absence of human fidelity. She betrayed everyone, even Wade. I read through the transaction history, meticulous, calculated, remorseless. The offshore account showed Colleen hadn't just abandoned Wade when the poisoning plot collapsed. She'd been planning to leave him with nothing since the year Brennan turned 8. I closed the laptop. I didn't print the ledger. I didn't add it to the blue notebook sitting on the shelf behind me. Colleen's already serving 40 years. Wade's already serving 25. The offshore account doesn't change anything. File closed. 2 weeks after the trial ended on a Sunday evening that smelled like wood smoke and maple syrup, Brennan found the blue notebook. First weekend, they officially moved their permanent belongings into my home. Dinner plates clearing in the kitchen fire, ticking quietly in the hearth. Ivy upstairs, organizing her new bedroom. I was helping Brennan shift old reference texts onto the high pine shelves, when he paused, his hand resting on something tucked behind the IRS field manuals. Small blue leather notebook. 12 clean lines inside each one marking a date, a timestamp, a medical notation that led inexorably toward December 4th. Brennan pulled it down, flipped through the pages slowly. His expression didn't change, but his thumb traced one of the entries. November 23rd, the day I'd noted the second nosebleed. How long did you actually know something was wrong? He asked quietly. Didn't know anything, Brennan. Suspected. 2 separate disciplines. I set down the stack of manuals. Federal investigator never alters the perimeter based on impulse. You wait until the numbers align into an undeniable trail. Move too early, the target clears the ledger and walks out of the room. Brennan looked at me, that gray-eyed steadiness that reminded me so much of Margaret. IRS regulation. No, just a rule for keeping a child safe. Brennan is holding the blue notebook, 12 lines that tracked his poisoning across 3 months, and he's asking me if it was regulation to wait that long. It wasn't regulation. It was love trying not to get a child killed by moving too fast. He closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to me. You counted every day. Every single one. He nodded once, then went back to shelving the reference text. We didn't talk about it again, but the notebook stayed on the shelf where he could see it, proof that someone had been watching, counting, preparing to act the moment the evidence became undeniable. 3 days later, Ruth met me at a Broadway cafe on a brilliant Portland spring afternoon that felt like absolution. 2 white ceramic coffee mugs on the green laminate table. Sunshine streaming through the window, warm enough that we'd both shed our jackets. Ruth had dropped the clinical sharpness she carried through the investigation, and her question came without preamble. Do you carry regret about how the gears turned Eugene the hidden camera above the counter? The night we forced the door lock, the look on Wade's face when the cuffs dropped. All of it. I stared into the coffee for a long moment. I regret one calculation. I waited for the accounting trail to reach absolute legal perfection instead of acting on raw instinct 2 weeks earlier. If I'd broken the kitchen door open in November, Brennan wouldn't have spent the final 14 days absorbing that chemical into his tissue. Ruth's hand came down firm on my sleeve. Eugene, if you'd hit that house 2 weeks earlier without the complete 12-dose video log and ATM transaction trail, Colleen's attorneys would have had the evidentiary file thrown out before the grand jury read the header. Wade and Colleen would be walking that kitchen right now. Those children would still be drinking from those flasks. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd built 100 cases on methodical precision. The process worked because you kept your head cold. You didn't fail them. You saved them. How long does guilt weigh on you before someone finally tells you that you did it right? 4 months. 123 days since the 2:47 a.m. call, and Ruth's hand on my sleeve is the first time I believe I didn't fail him. The cafe smelled like roasted coffee and fresh pastry, and the particular spring sunshine that only happens in Portland when the rain finally breaks. Outside the window, people walked past in shirt sleeves, the whole city celebrating the weather. Ruth's hand stayed firm on my sleeve, and I looked at it, really looked at it, and for the first time since the 2:47 a.m. phone call in December, the hard iron band around my chest completely let go. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, paid the bill, and stepped out into the spring sunshine that felt like permission to stop carrying the weight. Ruth paused on the sidewalk, adjusting her sunglasses. "Margaret would be proud of your timing." I offered a rare smile, the first one that felt genuine in months. She'd say I should have used better ink. Ruth and I parted ways on that Broadway sidewalk, and 10 days later, Margaret's legacy became real in a way that transcended courtrooms and DNA reports. The walnut signature table in the U.S. Bank estate vault was polished to a mirror finish, and Brennan's pen hovered over the line where Margaret's $8 million officially becomes his. Mid-May, quiet morning. The private estate management suite sat 3 floors above Southwest Broadway, deep carpets, acoustic paneling, the kind of hushed atmosphere where generational wealth changes hands without fanfare. Attorney Harrington had spread the administrative transfer documents. Across the oversized table, 3 signature pads arranged in precise alignment. The surname on that signature line is Hartley. Same 7 letters Wade carried, but it means something completely different now. 4 months ago it meant poisoning and betrayal. Today it means Margaret's legacy secured and a grandson who gets to build his own road. Brennan signed each document with careful precision. Harrington witness stamped, filed each page into the appropriate folder with practiced efficiency. The structure your grandmother built gives you discretionary access to 5% draw per annum until your 25th birthday. Harrington explained, sliding a summary sheet across the table. The principle remains in the conservative municipal bond, indices Margaret selected. She wanted you to have security without temptation. Brennan listened with absolute focus, took precise notes in a spiral ledger he'd brought. Specifically for this meeting, asked clean questions about quarterly yields and tax allocation. The 18-year-old who'd nearly surrendered this entire inheritance in my law office had transformed into someone who understood exactly what responsibility looked like. Near the conclusion, Brennan paused, pen hovering over his notes. "Can I allocate a portion of the first-year yield to clear undergraduate tuition balances at Portland State?" Harrington's gaze shifted to me. I offered a single nod. "That's exactly why your grandmother built that wall, son, to make sure your road was clear. Margaret died when Brennan was 14. She never got to see him. Graduate high school, never got to see him survive what Wade and Colleen did to him. But she built this wall anyway, brick by brick, just in case her grandson ever needed it. And now he's using it for tuition, not luxury cars or reckless spending, exactly what she hoped." The accounts cleared. Brennan tucked the summary documents into his messenger bag with the same careful precision he'd used signing them. We left the vault together, walked out into Portland's spring sunshine that felt like permission to start building something new. 3 weeks later, on a brilliant Sunday morning in early June, I placed a small package next to Ivy's breakfast plate. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen's double-hung windows, warming the old fir floors. Fresh coffee dripped into the glass carafe, filling the room with that particular morning smell that means home. Ivy looked at the package, plain brown paper tied with string, then up at me with cautious curiosity. "Open it!" She unwrapped carefully, revealing a fresh notebook bound in blue leather, identical to the journal I'd carried through 30 years of federal service. She opened to the first interior page where I'd inked a single header. "What I noticed today." "What am I supposed to put here, Dad?" "Anything that catches your eye that everyone else is too busy running past to remember. I'm giving Ivy the same blue leather notebook I carried through 30 years of federal investigations. The same discipline that tracked financial fraud across 3 continents is now tracking whether her brother remembered to recycle empty syrup bottles. And somehow that feels exactly right. I didn't give her secondary instructions. I didn't look over her shoulder. That page belonged to her ledger, now not mine. Ivy uncapped her pen, immediately squared her shoulders with the particular focus of someone taking a task seriously, and began her first entry. I stepped to the stove, started pulling out the waffle iron, deliberately didn't watch. Brennan walked in 5 minutes later, hair messy from sleep stopped behind his sister's chair. "What are you logging already?" Ivy didn't lift her pen from the page. "I noticed you drank the last of the maple syrup yesterday afternoon, then put the empty plastic bottle back on the top shelf, so you wouldn't have to carry it to the bin." Brennan's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: surprise, guilt, resignation, and then he turned to the recycling drawer without a word. Ivy laughed. Real laughter. The first time that sound had echoed through these rafters in 2 years. I flipped the waffle iron closed and let the sound wash over me like absolution. 6 weeks later, on a midweek morning in late July, heavy summer green covering the yard, the morning mail arrived on the cedar porch rail. One envelope stood out from the utility bills and grocery circulars. Thick cream stationery, no postal stamp or return address, just my name in sharp block lettering. I opened it standing on the front steps. Single folded sheet of executive paper. "Mr. Hartley, account cleared. Structural lesson will remain. Pacific Northwest Life Insurance Legal Division. Formal acknowledgement." My forensic trail had saved their corporate repository from paying out $5 million in fraudulent death benefits. The kind of letter that usually gets framed, displayed in home offices, cited in professional biographies. Pacific Northwest Life Insurance just thanked me for saving them $5 million, and I'm about to drop their letter into the recycling bin without a second thought. I read it twice, folded the paper along its original creases, and dropped it into the recycling bin with the morning newsprint. Brennan caught me carrying the bin down the porch steps, incredulous. "Corporate Legal sends you an executive thank you for saving them $5 million, and you drop it next to the coffee grounds. I've read enough tax code to know when the balance sheet's already done." Brennan stood on the porch steps, holding the discarded envelope, staring at the cream stationery, like it was evidence of mental instability. He looked back through the screen door at me, rinsing breakfast dishes like I hadn't just casually discarded corporate gratitude with the morning newsprint. "You are an incredibly strange man, Dad." I didn't turn from the sink. I know. Brennan called me strange that July morning, and by late August, I'd learned that strange was just another word for steady. The movie was running quietly when Ivy's voice cut through the warm summer evening without looking away from the screen. "Dad, are we going to stay in this house now, like for good?" Late August. 3 months post-move. Warm, still summer night windows thrown wide, catching the breeze off the West Hills. The movie tracked across the television in soft colors, washing light over the old furniture Margaret picked out 20 years ago. Brennan stretched across the sofa, eyes half closed. Ivy sat on the large floor-cushioned chin, resting on her knees. The question dropped into the room like a stone. Brennan shifted his head on the sofa cushion, eyes moving to my chair, waiting. The question hung in the air like smoke. 3 months they've been here, and she's still not sure if it's permanent. I pressed the remote. The audio silenced entirely. I looked at the two of them, one who survived a betrayal. No child should see one girl, who showed more courage on a witness stand than grown men I'd put there during 30 years of federal investigations. "This is your home, Ivy. Yours and Brennan's. The deeds are locked in the vault. The signatures are cleared. There isn't a person alive who can ever try to shift you out of these rooms again." Ivy offered a single firm nod, as if I'd simply established a mathematical law rather than a family promise. She reached out, tapped the volume back, and returned her focus to the movie without another word. Brennan locked eyes with me for one quiet second, slow relaxation hitting his shoulders like weight releasing, then looked back at the screen. Ivy needed to hear it out loud that this house is hers, that no one can take it away, that permanence isn't just implied, but declared and legally secured. 3 months she's been living here, and she still needed structural confirmation. Sometimes the most critical family commitments don't require an auditorium to be real. The movie finished. We said goodnight. They went upstairs to their rooms that are theirs now, not borrowed, not temporary. I stayed in my chair, listening to the old house settle around us, creaking in the summer heat, holding us safe. 4 months later, rare heavy Portland snow fell on Christmas Eve. December 24th, 2024. 1 year post-crisis, a decade-type winter storm blanketed the city packing. Clean white layers over the porch railings muffling the quiet street, in that particular silence that only comes with heavy snow. Inside deep blazing wood fire, the scent of roasted rosemary chicken filling every room, Howard's booming voice echoing through the dining nook, warm light reflecting off frosted window panes. The very first holiday dinner requiring every extra table leaf to hold all the plates. 1 year ago tonight, I got the 2:47 a.m. phone call that tore my world apart. Tonight, rare Portland snow is falling outside like a benediction, and my kitchen smells like Margaret's rosemary chicken recipe, and Howard Hartley is holding court near the hearth, with stories told at twice the necessary volume. Howard had brought heavy red wine from Beaverton, arrived before the snow started in earnest, and immediately claimed the chair closest to the fire. Ruth arrived 30 minutes behind him with an apple pie she'd started it at dawn, the crust golden and perfect steam still rising when she set it on the cooling rack. Brennan stood at the stove methodically whipping mashed potatoes, following the exact handwritten annotations in Margaret's old recipe card tin. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, face flushed from the heat, the same concentrated expression Margaret used to wear when she cooked Sunday dinners in this exact kitchen. Ivy sat on the rug near the small corner fir tree we'd cut from a farm outside Sandy, using colored construction paper and twine to construct handmade ornaments. She'd been working on them for 3 days, each one carefully measured and tied the kind of patient craftwork that required absolute focus. I didn't offer tactical directions or check anyone's progress. I simply sat in my old chair watching the room move around me. Brennan is at the stove making Margaret's mashed potatoes from her handwritten recipe cards. Ivy is on the rug making ornaments by hand. Ruth is checking the apple pie timer. Howard is laughing too loud about something that happened in 1987. And I'm sitting here watching it all, realizing it took me 60 years to understand that the primary father duty isn't auditing accounts or tracing fraud. It's simply occupying space and letting the room be safe. The snow continued falling outside thick and steady, the kind that sticks and builds and transforms the city into something clean and new. Through the frosted windows, the street lamps cast yellow halos in the white darkness. Ruth moved between the kitchen and dining room, setting out Margaret's good plates, the ones we only used for holidays. Howard poured wine into glasses, his commentary running continuous on everything from the Blazers season to property tax assessments to why nobody makes decent sourdough anymore. 1 year ago tonight, I got a phone call at 2:47 in the morning. Tonight I'm watching Brennan make Margaret's mashed potatoes while snow falls outside. The timer chimed. Brennan pulled the chicken from the oven, golden skin herbs crusted perfectly, the smell filling the house with the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. He set it on the wooden carving board, grabbed the towel off his shoulder, and leaned through the kitchen pass-through. "Dinner's on wood, Dad. Get over here before Howard clears the platter." Howard's voice boomed from the dining room. "I heard that, and I'm not apologizing for having reasonable expectations about portion size." The journey started at 2:47 in the morning with a phone call that tore my world apart. It's ending in a kitchen that smells like Margaret's recipes, with rare snow locking out the city, and a family I built from choice, instead of blood, sitting around a table I never thought I'd fill again.